Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Ashley and I here co-hosting. Stephanie Lepp. We were just on a podcast with you.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about how you? Well, one, I want to hear about yourself. You know what you're up to. I know you work with. Well, you can talk about that. Podcast with you, and you. I guess we got on your radar with Doomer Optimism. So tell us who you are and how you kind of like came across us and you know.
Yeah. Well, the original radar was Memetic Mediation, actually. Yeah. Because one I can yes. Hello everyone. I'm Stephanie Lepp. I am a producer and a conceptual artist. I I guess the connection to Memetic Mediation. I used to produce a podcast called Reckonings that told the stories of people who've made all kinds of transformation, people who've expanded their political worldviews, people who've transcended violent extremism, people who've recovered from addiction, people who've made all kinds of transformative change. And always the interest of mine was not just a change in views, but a change in the way that we relate to our views. So it's not just like, oh, I shifted my views on abortion, but like, oh, I can actually hold my views tighter and looser. I can instead of being kind of like fearfully attached to an ideology, I can have some kind of ideological liberty. I can be critical of it. I can kind of examine it. I can adapt it to change to reflect the changing reality around me. So there is a sense in which the entire cast of Reckonings, they almost, it's like they almost developed a memetic mediation capacity just by virtue of going from one tribe to another tribe. You develop this sense, oh wait, there are different tribes. I happen to be a bridge from one tribe to another, but there are different tribes, right? And the tribes, like, we're not going anywhere. So there's a way in which just watching our own consciousness change or evolve kind of, it's like it almost develops a capacity for memetic mediation that my guest didn't necessarily have to read in a book. But yeah, right now I'm the executive producer at the Center for Humane Technology. So if you watch The Social Dilemma, we are the organization that was at the heart of that film. And I guess just to bring it back to Doomer Optimism, yeah, as a parent, I know you both are also parents. There's a commitment, or as soon as I had kids, was like, well, yeah, I am committed to Doomer Optimism. I'm committed to both seeing the world clearly and also in a way that gives me a way through, or a way to a future that I can feel kind of responsible bequeathing to my children. Yeah, there's a way in which Doomer Optimism is yeah, for all you parents out there, you might have had a similar experience. But as a content creator, I think there's also kind of, I feel like I also have a little bit of an implicit commitment to seeing the nature of the situation, the gravity of our situation clearly, and also in a way that gives me agency, because I have to kind of take responsibility for my shaping of the future with the content that I am creating and putting out there. So maybe I'll just leave it there. That's a little bit about me and my connection to you.
So do you want to talk a little bit more this term memetic mediation? Of course, I'm familiar with it. You talk about tribes. Is this tribes in the Amazon? Is this tribes in the Serengeti? What is this tribes memetic mediation thing?
Yeah, I'm thinking more than anything else in terms of ideological tribes. But something that I noticed in my guests is, yeah, is this capacity to not just be inside of a way of thinking, but have a capacity to examine it and reflect on it and be mindful of it. And again, it kind of amazes me that that capacity can evolve within the context of a personal experience. Like, I love to get nerdy. It's like, give me all the books and all the articles and talks about memetic mediation and anything. And yet, thank God that a lot of that, like this capacity to be mindful of one's way of thinking, can emerge within the context of just watching yourself grow, watching yourself change, which hopefully happens to most of us in our lifetime if we are paying attention, at least once.
I'm wondering if you could maybe just riff a bit on the Center for Humane Technology. I think just social media plays a huge role in this like tribal formation. And we'll talk a little bit about, I mean, on Doomer Optimism a lot on IRL in real life experiences, making a huge difference in like pulling apart some of the polarity that results in social media, you know? So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on that, just generally.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the way that most of us experience, the way that social media is constructed right now, the platforms that we use right now are absolutely just, sending us into our little memetic tribes, into our little filter bubbles, and kind of pitting us against each other. And actually, I mean, that is kind of a good segue into what we're going to talk about today, synthetic strategy, the capacity to kind of see the different ways of doing things and think about, even if there is one way that you prefer or one way that you identify with, see how the different ways can fit together or collaborate or even cross-pollinate. But yeah, right now, so I guess let's like maybe we can redraw the axes from social media versus not social media or technology versus not technology to how might we design social media? How might we design technology that actually enables the kinds of things that enables, we could say, even memetic mediation? I mean, I'll just make it very concrete. Right now, social media, what are the metrics that we're tracking? Numbers of likes, numbers of followers, numbers, like what if we were tracking numbers of likes from people who usually don't like the same thing? What if we were tracking people who blocked you and then unblocked you and followed you? What if we were tracking like wormholes between echo chambers, like people who have the capacity to speak to two echo chambers who would otherwise never be connected to each other? That would be really interesting. Those would be really interesting metrics to track. So yeah, right now, yeah, the way that social media is constructed, I mean, go ahead and watch The Social Dilemma. That'll tell you everything you need to know about. And I guess and there are ways to build it and construct it, and even just like I think it would be possible to actually build an alternate interface for Twitter that tracks completely different metrics, right? That give us the info. Like, are we creating more of a shared reality, or more of a, I'll just go ahead and say, robust marketplace of ideas where the ideas actually encounter each other, or are we not? I think there are ways. So yeah, I guess it's not like pro tech versus anti tech, and I know you're not anti tech, but how might we design the tech? Like, what does the tech need to do?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't help but put this in like Ivan Illich terms. Like, how do we use it to make us more present and with each other and with ourselves? It's not about tech or anti-tech. It's about how you relate to tech, and it seems like that's what you're describing.
Yeah, and I'll even be a little more blasphemous about it. Like, it's not even like when we had the Facebook whistleblower. So for those of you who don't know, social media had its big tobacco moment, quote unquote, last fall. A whistleblower came out from Facebook. Her name is Frances Haugen. She is amazing. She screenshotted she had to like do it via screenshot, but got all of this information out. She testified before Congress. Biden invited her to the State of the Union. This has been a big deal, and we had her on the show. And what is maybe the most amazing thing about her, in my mind, is that she wants to work at Facebook again. It is not people inside of Facebook versus people outside of Facebook. It's people who want to transform social media so that it serves humanity and the survival of humanity, versus, I don't know if I want to say people who don't, but the fact that she wants to work there again, for me, I'd be like, dude, Zuckerberg, hand her the keys, right? She knows what's wrong and she actually cares and wants to do something about it. So Yeah.
So a few points and kind of questions or comments, and you can see how you want to respond to them. So it seems like, I mean, I know that you're coming from kind of an integral framework, and so you kind of see these stages of development, right? You know, one framework that was influential for me for a while was Robert Keegan's framework. But I guess so. It seems like what you're describing is you see kind of where in technology is kind of accelerated, this kind of postmodern, you know, everyone's kind of creating their own reality. Arguably, it started on the left, and now it's very much gone to the right as well. And everyone's kind of creating their own little realities. From an integral perspective, this is problematic because reality is wholesome, it's holistic. From a libertarian perspective, or even perhaps from a localist perspective, perhaps you could argue it's just fine because leave people alone, let people create their own realities, right? Why do we need to integrate everyone into one fabric? Isn't that totalitarian? Even soft totalitarian? Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, this actually does feel kind of like a perfect segue
Okay.
into what we're here to talk about, because I mean, the integral answer is all of the above, right? The integral answer is, well, who do we want to be? What do we want? Where are we trying to go? Like, under some circumstances, yeah, let people have their own, right? There are certain things. It's like, am I going to take away my daughter's belief in unicorns? Like, probably not yet. She's 5 and she knows that unicorns are not real. But, you know, under some circumstances, for sure, let people have their own, whatever it is. You know, it just depends on the context, I think, and what it is we're trying to achieve. And if we're trying to have, let's say, a democracy, I mean, it's at what scale, let's say, is it worth trying to integrate our realities, and for what purpose? I wouldn't go as far as to say it's like always necessary for everything, you know, or I say, like, I jokingly say, I'm so open-minded, I'm even willing to be closed-minded sometimes. It's like, it just kind of depends on what we're trying to do. Maybe I'm just the ultimate pragmatist in that sense.
Yeah, so I think let's get into synthetic strategy. Maybe you could explain what it is, and then let's apply it practically, so we can get out of the theoretical and like see if it works, like see how it works. Play a little bit with how it works.
Yeah, well, cool. Thank you. And I guess just to, yeah, so for listeners, this thing I'm bringing that I'm calling synthetic strategy, I haven't actually talked about this publicly. So being debuted right here, folks. We're going to see how this works. So yeah, I'm going to introduce, I'll talk for a few minutes, and then we can just dive in and try to use it and see what happens. So, but just to start from Doomer Optimism. So I just re-listened to your conversation with Jim Rutt, which was a great conversation. And you say that Doomer Optimism does not need to put everyone under one big tent, right? This is kind of what we were just talking about. It's more of a constellation of small adjacent tents, right? But then the question is kind of like, well, then what is the glue that binds these small adjacent tents? Like, how can we not go into just one tent while maintaining some basis for cross-pollination between the adjacent tents? And Jason, I think you called yourself a theory of change pluralist. So how can theory of change pluralism be operationalized? So synthetic strategy is, I'll just say, a potential framework for enabling collaboration or cross-pollination between the adjacent tents. So what is it? So I'm going to give a very specific example that is from not my work, someone else's work. And the example is leadership. So what does it mean to be a good leader, or how do we think about effective leadership? So a few years ago, emotional intelligence expert Daniel Goleman, he interviewed. So I think it's like every couple of months, Harvard Business Review comes out with an article. It's like the 10 qualities of a good leader, but like, is that the same under all circumstances? Like what is needed from leadership in different circumstances? So he interviewed hundreds of leaders, and he identified 6 distinct leadership styles. You don't need to keep this in your head, but so commanding, visionary, affiliative, democratic, pace setting, and coaching. Don't worry, you don't need to remember them. The point is there are 6. And he plotted them in a matrix. So on the top row, you have the 6 different leadership styles. The first row describes what these different styles do. So you can just kind of imagine this in your mind. So commanding demands immediate compliance. That's what it does. Visionary mobilizes people towards a vision. Affiliative creates harmony and builds emotional bonds. I'll just use those 3. I don't need to go through all of them. Another row in this matrix identifies the circumstances in which each leadership style is the most effective. So commanding is really helpful in a crisis to kickstart a turnaround, or if there are problem employees. And I should say, this is not so like cut and dry. It's not like he's just identifying clusters. This is obviously a map, not the territory. Okay, commanding, really helpful in a crisis. Visionary, really helpful when changes require a new vision or when a clear direction is needed. Affiliative is really helpful to heal rifts in a team. I'm just reading off the table here. To heal rifts in a team or to motivate people in stressful circumstances. So that's already really helpful. It's like, cool, there is not one definition of a leader. There's not like the best leader. It's just like, what kind of leadership style is the most effective in which circumstance? But that's not where the brilliance of his approach ends. It's not just like which strategy in which circumstance. It's also, he's also looking at the leadership style's impact on the organizational climate. So commanding, surprise, surprise, has a negative impact because it's not that fun to be commanded. Like, even if you're in a crisis and you know it's going to help you get out, it just doesn't feel that good. Visionary is the most strongly positive because it does feel really good to mobilize around a shared vision with other people. Affiliative is positive because it feels good to get along or to go from not getting along to getting along. So in this context, what makes someone an amazing leader isn't necessarily being visionary, because that's the one that's the most fun. It's knowing how to adapt between different styles depending on what the circumstance requires, or knowing, check it out, we're in a circumstance where my leadership style is not what we need, and therefore I need to hand the baton to somebody else until we get into a situation where my leadership style is called for. So it's not that, so just to kind of summarize and bring this back, like, it's not that commanding is always, bad and visionary is always good. Different circumstances call for different styles, but some styles are more enjoyable for everyone than others. So if we're in a crisis, I can tell my team, hey team, I'm going to shift into hard ass mode for a second to get us out of this crisis and into a situation where we don't have to use commanding anymore, right? We use the strategy that maybe we don't love to get ourselves out of the into the circumstances where we can use strategies that we actually prefer. So I guess just like posed as a question, the question that synthetic strategy would ask is, under what circumstances, if any, do we use which strategy or combination of strategies to achieve a goal?
Quick question. What leadership style is this meta framework most influenced by? Like, if we were to see, it sounds to me kind of an affiliative leadership style, because you're trying to make the different leadership styles get
along.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of why I say I'm so open-minded. I'm even open to being closed-minded sometimes. It's like, but why can't we include commanding? It's like, sure, the meta is integral, right? That's the meta. The meta is bringing them all together for sure. And like, would I say under some circumstances, throw this all away? Honestly, I'm not wise enough to know the answer to that question. My hunch is like, the circumstance in which this whole thing is not useful is probably like, this whole thing has a strong orientation towards pragmatism. What do we need to do in order to achieve the goal that we collectively decided was the goal we wanted to achieve? So what circumstance would that not be useful in? I don't know, maybe where we want spontaneity. Maybe when would we not prioritize pragmatism? Yeah, that's my sense. Is a situation in which, like, maybe we've gotten to a place where we're all so like getting along / like down for whatever, that like achieving our goal doesn't even matter anymore, because the goal is just like being together through the passage of time.
And
I don't know.
In that case, it's not really like leadership anymore then, because it's leadership is like attempting to lead some group into reaching some sort of goal, right? So then maybe that's not even within that framework.
It's missing a column. It's missing a column for eject button. Like seriously, no, like it's missing a column for when to not use this framework anymore at all. That would be the like meta. But I wouldn't like hone in too much on leadership. It's more that I see this template, I see what he did, Daniel Goleman, as like as like kind of creating a template for theory of change pluralism, or how to enable collaboration between different small tents, you know, and you can use it in all kinds of domains. I'll just give some other examples and then we can dive in. Like energy, right? Under what circumstances, if any, does it make sense to use which solar, wind, nuclear, coal, like or combination thereof? Higher education, under what circumstances? College versus trade school versus internship versus soul searching. Like currency, under what circumstances? Traditional fiat money or a local currency and or a time bank and or bartering and or you could even apply to economic systems, like under what circumstances? Capitalism, socialism, communism. Like I actually think this is kind of what China is doing, which is part of why I think we don't understand what China is doing. And call me crazy. COVID treatments. I think this would have been so helpful if instead of like vaccines versus ivermectin versus Paxlovid versus, it's like under what circumstances? Masks, vaccine, like there are circumstances under which vaccines don't make sense, you know, and that's okay. That doesn't mean you know, so I guess like whatever it is that you are involved, like listener, whatever it is that you are involved in, you can imagine using this matrix as like a very, again, map is not the territory, but just to get like a rough like synthetic strategy for some, because it gets all the ways of doing it on the table. There are some we're going to leave off, right? Like slavery, we can leave it off. Like there's a bunch of things we can just leave off the table entirely. But for the ones that we're not going to leave off the table entirely, then we just think about, okay, what are the affordances of each strategy? Under what circumstances does it make sense to use them? And if there's no circumstance under which your strategy is not the best strategy, well, then perhaps you're an ideologue. And you're not going to play ball, you know, you're not going to like play ball with the other tents. So yeah, maybe I'll just pause here. Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of things that resonate that seem to come up a lot in the Doomer Optimism conversations. One is people are often talking about scale and how scale totally changes what the outcome that you would even want might be, let alone how a certain strategy would play out. Like one strategy at the scale of the individual might be different than the strategy you would use even at the scale of like a relationship or a household versus like a nation state or whatever. So that super resonates. What did you say something, Jason?
Like fractal localism.
Totally. Yeah. And I think we could apply it to scales. Literally, you could do like it would be a little, but like what kinds of activities are most effective at which scales of human organization?
Right. And then, and I think just thinking about just keeping in mind that that's the case is so important. And then you can be open to so many different strategies, but you need to be thinking like about the particular. And then another thing that resonates is it seems to me one of the sources of what I always to call cultish behavior, but you might call like really strong tribal behavior, is when somebody's got a strategy in mind and in their head that strategy solves everything. So it's like Bitcoin fixes this is the perfect thing where like I do think Bitcoin does fix something, and I've always like said and been very agnostic about what Bitcoin fixes, but it doesn't fix like this. Like I mean every single thing not every single thing, but so often I'll post like we've got this problem to solve, and somebody literally just comes on Twitter and says Bitcoin fixes this, and it's just you know, it. So I think that's another thing that really resonates, is just thinking about like what solution makes most sense to what problem, and to not be ideologically tied to the idea that one strategy solves everything.
And the people who are critiquing the work that they're doing, which is so helpful often, the people who are, is like, they are identifying the circumstances under which a strategy is not useful. Thank you. So important. Thanks for helping us define that, you know? And so there's a way in which like we're playing on the same team. It's like you're doing the work of like experimenting with all the things we could possibly use this for, and you're just going to go overboard and try to apply to everything. And then there's the people who are like, actually, it didn't really work for that. Cool. Now we understand this thing better and how to use it.
Yeah. And I think like, well, I'll just make one follow-up comment and then I'll let Jason go. But I think what's also really important is to not tie your identity. So many people tie their identities to these to like a practical set of solutions or an approach. And I think that can be really limiting, and can cause a lot of strife in so many different ways, where you're just, you know, you cannot admit that maybe, you know, there's just this cognitive dissonance. Like you cannot admit when your strategy doesn't work in some circumstance. It's like, it's okay. It doesn't have to solve everything.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to tie up your identity in it. So yeah, that is it's a hard and but important skill.
I have one question, I guess, and I don't know if well, let's see. I don't know if I'm really curious about. I think I have my own ideas about it, but who would be applying this strategy? Because I assume that a lot of people aren't going to play ball with abstract frameworks, period, right? And so maybe you can sell it as pragmatism, but then they're like, okay, well, I've always been pragmatic. It's you know, eggheads who now are talking about pragmatism, but I know how to run my ship, or my small business, or my homestead, or my small farm. It's been working for a while, and you all just won't listen to me. So that's really the problem. I'm not, this all sounds, and so I guess my question is, does this framework, and I think I know the answer because I think in Integral it does this framework integrate parts of itself, being like all of reality or society, that will not explicitly want to adopt the framework, but will want to live within their own frameworks, and they're not interested in cross-pollinating? Thank you very much.
Some people may not need to, right? If your homesteading thing is working for you, why do you care like what's needed in another circumstance that's not your own? Mm-hmm. Like this is like, it's either, I mean, yeah, sure, it's maybe for eggheads within the context of like, if you want to write a book about sustainable agriculture and you want to kind of, and like people are being like, oh, but this doesn't work at a small scale. It's like, yeah, we'll check it out. There are other kinds of things that can work at large scale. And you're trying to give like I'll call it synthetic strategy, like here is what sustainable agriculture at every single scale looks like. Mm-hmm. Like it might be helpful for you, or like for policy making or something, but like for the person who only is in one circumstance that requires the strategy that they are already using. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe that's also the answer to your initial question of like, do we all need to, I forget how we asked it, but like, do we need to have a shared reality? It's like, yeah, for the person who's homesteading and it works for them, they don't need to, but I think this kind of framework kind of like operates at multiple scales. Like there's probably somewhere in your life where you're kind of like, even as a parent, it's like, under what circumstances do I just like take the rabbit listened approach? I don't know if folks are familiar with that, but it's like, do I, give my daughter a timeout versus just kind of like be with her in the tantrum that she's having or whatever it is? And not that you're going to have to like spell it out, but just kind of the sensibility. Like there are many strategies I could use in order to achieve a particular goal. Yeah. And what strategies call for. And I probably want to minimize the timeouts maybe, because that's the commanding that's going to like start grating at our relationship. Or I don't know. I'm like just riff, like for those of you who use timeouts, it's all good.
Well,
I do too.
Let me just
Sometimes.
let me extend the context in which I asked that question a little bit. So we have a lot of conversations on this podcast about how we've forgotten, a lot of us, of just kind of, we've forgotten common sense, and we've forgotten kind of relationality, and just how relationships actually work. And we've outsourced a lot of our care and responsibility to institutions, whether it be to the market or to the state, to technocratic nudgers, whoever it may be. And a lot of conversations, I think, our conversations lean in the direction, we need to rediscover the domestic. We need to rediscover our own intuitions and our own common sense. And we need to be given the autonomy to do so. So how does that fit in to this? Is this part of kind of this, different scale for a different sensibility?
If I'm understanding you correctly, I think the relationality fits in. Okay, because right now I still kind of presented this kind of like billiards ball-ish thing where it's like which strategy for which circumstance, except for the fact that your strategy affects the circumstance. That's what's wild about this. That's what's so amazing about this. It's like, it's not just like I'm like using a hammer on a thing and then it's like, no, you changed the thing by using the hammer. I changed my relationship with my daughter by giving her a timeout. So like we are agents in this thing, so that's where this thing is co-evolving. We are like co-evolving with so that's where the relationality, that's where like where can I go with that? It's like where I can go with that is like when we are using a strategy we don't like, it's like it's only justified, and that still sounds kind of abstract, but like it's only justified if it's going to change the circumstance into one in which we don't need to use it anymore. Like it's a totally different way to think about a strategy or like a hammer. It's like, because it's not just if you're like, I don't know how clear I mean, but it's not just like using the right tool. Yeah, it's like it's a co-evolving phenomenon. So
Oh wait, let me
win-win, all that their win-win possibilities always exist, or does it also allow for that there are just some adversarial power relationships that cannot be resolved?
That is what you're affecting, I think, with the way you are acting. You are making the game more or less infinite. I do think, though, if we're going to use a shitty strategy to the extent that we can all be aware, like, hey, we're going to use this to get us to like move us actually in the infinite game direction, you'll be like, it's like, hey, team, I'm going to be a hard ass for a second for a reason. Excuse me, I don't want to do this to myself. I don't want to turn myself into a total hard ass, but I'm going to like do it. Or maybe I'm going to like give myself, like, I've like joked that like the number of followers you have should like somehow correlate to the hours you spend in therapy. But like there's it's like if I'm gonna kind of like do this to like give myself this power or have this power over us or have a commanding power over us, well, I better keep my heart in check somehow so that the game can keep on like staying as infinite as possible.
Okay, so I have a couple of just like riffs. There's two things that really resonate with the tensions that we've had on Doomer Optimism. One tension is the extent to which something needs to be legible or self-reflective, or whether or not it can just be, this is I think what Jason was getting at, whether or not it can just be intuitive and internal and unknown to, unable to be explained. And so like one example of how this works is like on, the peasant agriculture. A lot of people who have a long-standing relationship with the land couldn't articulate it to somebody who's new to the land. They just like couldn't even explain it. So that's one tension. Another tension is whether or not something is applicable as like a heuristic across scales or across situations versus like totally scale specific and only as a useful thing in a particular circumstance. So these are all like resonant with this idea.
Yeah.
But I also just want to say this is like a kind of a maybe an LSD comment, but like Neil Spackman was on, and he's a guy who works in like regenerative ecosystems, and he made this comment towards the end of our discussion that basically like nature could be infinite if you like manage it the right way, and like infinitely growing its regenerative capacity.
Wow.
He's like, this is a long thing to get into, but like I just can't get that comment out of my head. And when you were saying like there is something about thinking about the limitations of one's power. And what I think Jason and I are always talking about is those limitations do change when you exercise your agency.
Totally.
And there's almost like a correlation there between like what Neil said about, the nature being potentially infinite and like us changing social systems being potentially infinite by our like injection.
Totally.
I told you this is an LSD comment, but
no, I love that. It's like we don't even know what we're capable of. It's so amazing. We don't even know.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm just thinking like today, I'm in this mom's chat, and this woman just had a baby, and we're just saying like, we're all here as resources if you need help with like getting settled or breastfeeding, and like how her whole world and capacity and agency opens up with that like invitation. Like it changes what the possibility space just because we're here and like able to help her through any issues she might have. So anyways, but I do think that it might be worthwhile to like now try to think about applying this and like playing with it a bit, maybe with the food systems example. I do think there is, maybe it would be interesting to first riff on like, okay, so if you have goals, some goal to meet, obviously there has to be like some values direction. So like, let's talk about that first, because I guess when you were saying about our appearance on Jim Rutt, there is something that is the glue, and that glue is some sort of value system. So like maybe we can riff on like, how do you even start with that?
I want to respond to that. Can I just respond to one thing
you said
before we, and then let's make it real. With the people who don't know how to, you called it peasant farming. Is that what you called it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is actually part of what I love about this is we get to see clearly which strategies are either like the most broadly applicable. I mean, that will become clear, and or the most fun. And that like appropriately prioritizes the people who know and so even if they can't explain it, it's like, hey, like it's pretty clear like who we want to kind of center, or whose like wisdom we want to like really take care of, because check it out. The ratio of like circumstance or whatever is like really pointing in their direction. So it's a very nice way of like, the kind of like recentering or like centering the people who should be centered is just like the simple way to put it. It's like if we're a flock and we need to fly, it's like it's really obvious like who should be leading the flock right now. So yeah. But okay, so how do we start with I mean, this is like the original question of democracy, like who are we and what do we want? Because it always comes back to that kind of. But like if we were just to make it specific to food, do we want to do food, growing food? I mean, how would you articulate the goal of, if you were, let's just say you were developing ag policy for the United States, how would you articulate the goal? Like the goal of this policy is to.
Jason, you go.
Well, I think we would have to start with a much better knowledge and respect of ecology and what traditional farmers knew just implicitly without knowing, the names of all the soil microorganisms, but knowing that when you take care of the soil, you prevent erosion, you're able to maintain diverse, ecosystem, different types of food products, that you're more resilient, that over many generations, you're able to continually provide nourishment for you, your family, your community, and perhaps outside. And so I think even before we try to talk about policy, it would just be, if I had all the people in the room, who are involved with food policy, I would say I would ask, what does it look like to center ecological knowledge, and ecological health and long-term sustainability, and perhaps, now, because we've done so much harm, regeneration. And so how do we, and so using that as kind of like a core value, how do we build off of that?
Well, let's keep that core value, and then let's actually just kind of do it the Daniel Goleman way. So let's say we were to choose like 6 different ways of growing food, right? We have, and this is, the question is which circumstances, if any, and the answer might be 0. So we can include large scale monoculture in there and decide under no circumstances. Like but let's, like, since that's also like the dominant way that we're still growing food, let's just like put it on the table. So we have like large scale monoculture. I'm just like large scale monoculture, large scale polyculture. I don't know, what would you like, mid scale permaculture / community garden, or no, let's make it you tell me. Community garden.
Maybe large scale monoculture, large scale organic.
Okay, I'm gonna just type these so we can look at them.
People call this like industrial organic. Then maybe something like small farms, which maybe are mixed in some monocropping, till agriculture, and some other things. Maybe permaculture farms.
Would those be like different? Could those be?
If permaculture farms would be like pretty strongly committed to not doing tilling agriculture, not using pesticides, and then maybe something like the individual homestead community garden scale. So like, you might just call it homesteading.
Great. So we have 6, right? We have large scale monoculture, industrial organic, small mixed farms, permaculture farms, home gardens, and then fully homesteading.
Yep.
Okay.
Can I add one more thing to the value set? So I said centering ecology, but I also want to add centering the cultural dynamics that enable long-term stewardship.
Great. Yeah. Well, what's great is, I mean, what you're doing, I think, is you're kind of like aligning the individual with the collective. Or here you're kind of
more like
aligning people and ecology.
Yeah. So it's recognizing, for example, that, as our conversation with this guy Mark Allen, who says we need to think of ourselves again as a keystone species, that humans have been managing ecosystems and landscapes for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. This isn't pristine wilderness
totally. We've been tending the wild.
And so and there's certain human cultural institutions that made that viable. That so I guess all I'm saying is that centering ecology, but also the necessary coevolution of ecology and culture that allows a system like that to exist long term.
Play the infinite game. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so then how, like, if we were just to go through these with these values in mind, like keeping these values in mind, under what circumstances, if any, large scale monoculture?
So there's multiple variables that we have to consider. One is we have to consider short term versus long term.
Okay, good. This
Uh,
is great. This is exactly because now we're starting to spell out the like
yeah,
affordances of each strategy.
yeah.
Okay, so variables like timeline
I'm like,
of like sustainability timeline. Is
right.
that
Yeah,
So
you
along
know what?
those lines, I would say that
what
large
timeline?
scale monoculture for some basic grains, legumes, wheat, um,
Oh,
needs to continue for a while as we make this transition, because a transition
timeline
like
of growth.
would take decades.
Yeah.
And if you tried to switch all over to agroecology or some other system overnight, it would be a complete disaster. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have
Yeah,
the,
you know what?
we don't have the knowledge. We don't have
I
enough.
think another thing, sorry, I think another thing worth saying out loud is that one of our values is, I think, like causing the least amount of human suffering
That sounds good.
in this transition, to this other larger goal. So,
Across,
like, if, for example, you want to be extremely ideological and it doesn't matter what happens in the meantime, as long as you get to the goal of like regenerative agriculture, there could be a shitload of horror that plays out if you do that too fast. So that's what Jason's getting to. Like
Yeah.
there is like that's another value that puts constraints on
mm-hmm.
what works and what.
Right. And I mean, ultimately the thing here that is being asked is like, how do we achieve the collective goal in the most individually enjoyable way possible?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's kind of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I think
not starving is more enjoyable than starving.
Yeah, no, totally. Good point. Eating is more enjoyable than starving, and that should be taken into account as we transform our, food production
And
system.
as we enter into probably a global food crisis that
Mm.
we are actually entering into. So
Yeah,
this isn't just theoretical at this point.
totally. Which then also brings online, actually, we didn't even include this, but all this like, I don't know, like just like synthetic food or like I don't know, right?
no,
I mean,
they
no.
don't get a seat at the table.
Okay, well then okay,
They're off the map. They're not even on the map. Although,
elaborate.
yeah, it might be.
We're going
It
to
might be.
disagree slightly here, Ashley, but go ahead.
No, this is
Okay.
good. This is
So
good.
there.
Gosh.
You're saying under no
Hey.
circumstances.
I think like the not okay. So for like lab meat or whatever, just no. Like it just uses more energy. It uses so much material. People are tossing shit tons of money on at it.
Mm.
When those resources could be directed other places, it's just like such a waste of everyone's attention and resources and money and whatever. If like our goal is to get to a regenerative system with the least amount of human suffering, that doesn't help us in any of those value systems, in my opinion. Jason, do you disagree?
I guess I don't know as much of how all the numbers line up. It's certainly not my preference, but I think that there could be situations like say our long-term goal is that we need to population needs to redistribute, not forcefully, but it'll just kind of happen through because we enjoy it, let's say, more across. More people need to be, we need many more farmers, we need many more, but there's still these large megacities, right? And if they can create a food tower that, grows some things in a vat in the shorter term that can provide a transition away from something like that, if that's ultimately real.
You know what? Okay, here's what I will concede. I'll concede like home level like insect patties. That's fine.
Cool.
If that keeps people alive,
I mean, but I think this is exactly home,
but not with like this microbial system that has to be in a lab.
Yeah.
Because then it's just like
this is great intensive. Because now we're starting to see the circumstances in which, right, the very limited circumstances in which this approach. So to your point, it's like that is taking an appropriate amount of money and attention relative to the usefulness, the utility of it as a strategy for achieving the broader goal.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess from where I'm coming from is I think it's going to happen anyway. It's happening. I'm pushing in a different direction. Ashley and I are pushing in a different direction. But, you know, and this is, I guess, is part of my pluralism is like, if the cities, you know, can help feed themselves, which is a big task, especially if we're facing a much lower net energy future, and if they don't decrease in size or they don't just become, you know, more spread out and much more urban agriculture, you know, oriented, there might have to be some emergency measures to get calories into people. It's certainly,
Totally.
you know, it's certainly not a holistic approach. It's not the approach I'm working on. But who am I to say if, you know, a city of 20 million people has to adopt an emergency measure for a few years as, you know, we transition to a better, you know, a better approach.
But that's
Okay.
what's helpful is you can say, you can actually define the emergency circumstance. You can be like, if this, this, and this, and this, that's when you use the emergency measure. But up until that point, we're still like doing something else or like investing in something else.
Okay, so here's my question about the synthetic strategy then. Are we using this as a model in which under which the ideal circumstances are available to us, or are we dealing with the world as it is? Because like, let's just say, for example, a bunch of dumb VC funders waste a bunch of their money on this microbe food burgers, but that they've already invested that infrastructure and it's there, and like it is producing, even though it's a stupid way to produce. But then there's like, you know, failures of just people getting regular industrial wheat. Like, you know, are we just entering into the equation this circumstance that's like the reality of circumstance, or are we dealing under like, you know, ideal conditions?
Well, the different I mean, per the leadership analogy, it's like the different strategies make sense in different circumstances. So you would be doing the work of identifying the circumstances that this micro burger fits in. But I don't know. I mean, honestly, it's like, does this become the basis for a conversation with one of those VCs? Maybe that's it. It's like, hey, VC, but we also have to keep in mind the VC is not hiring micro burgers to do the job of solving world hunger. It's hiring the micro burger to give him a return on his investment, which is like a totally different goal, right? Like that's kind of like I mean, not unrelated, but it's like, I mean, I guess this could be part of the conversation where you could be like, hey, since you said you're interested in global hunger, take a look at this. Now let's have a real conversation about what your actual goal, like, are you actually just trying to like get a return on your investment? Because if so, like, let's just change the whole game. Because like this whole game, but that's, I mean, that's beyond my pay grade for this for synthetic strat. I mean, I don't know, not necessarily. Although I mean, I guess
you know, it is like where idealism butts up against reality too. Like I think Jason and I are always just like screaming that our strategy, because we're the geniuses behind Doomer Optimism. Our strategy is pragmatic and you know, good for the environment, etc. But people are driven by other incentive structures out there, and so, you know, you can be as idealistic as you want, but this other thing exists that doesn't follow your value system.
Yeah, and to the extent we can be honest about the things that we're actually going for here, right? It's like, I mean, I know I'm opening a Pandora's box right now, but abortion, okay? Like, if what you're really interested in is preventing abortion from even needing to happen in the first place, you'd be pursuing all kinds of different strategies that are not picketing outside of Planned Parenthood, right? So, like, I know that sometimes people aren't even necessarily I are not even necessarily aware of like the actual goal that we have or what, but like, you know, it's like when confronted with evidence that your strategy is not achieving your stated goal, I mean, that just has to inspire me to ask some kind of questions about like, well, what goal am I actually after? Am I just scared? Am I trying to like avoid a feeling I don't want to have?
Right.
Maybe I need a therapist.
Well, and I do think there is something to like people who have completely different goals, using the language of the values system that we're identifying, for example, for the food system, when their obvious ends are totally different. And so there is like this thing where, you know, I could design a food system that does meet these goals, but you know, I'd be fighting against the people who are saying they're trying to design this system.
And, and maybe that's the glue. That's the glue between the tents. It's like, do we have a shared goal? Cool. Let's sit at the same table and work it out, you know, because the micro burger people maybe just don't have the same goal. And that's just the problem. Like, they're not actually interested. If and when they were, they'd sit at the table and be like, wow, you're right. Micro burgers are really not part of the, like, they're like an emergency measure in a limited circumstance that we don't even want to get to. Like, we don't want to get to the point where we need micro burgers.
Right. And I would say that I think, at least with Doomer Optimism, like, we do have certain values and glue that hold us together, and we don't really invite somebody. The other day I was like railing against George Monbiot because he argues for this as he argues for a farm-free future, and it's the complete opposite of what I argue for. I argue for a farm-full future. And somebody was like, why don't you invite George Monbiot on your podcast and debate with him? It's like, no, he doesn't get a seat at the table. It's just, I mean, I can talk to people who are like somewhat varied, but not somebody who's like come to such a completely different solution that doesn't fit with my values at all. Not to mention that he already has a big platform or whatever. But
can I throw in an element of theory of change here? And I know I said theory of change pluralist, but I also hew to, you know, one theory of change over another most of the time. And that's, well, one is, I think, a basic assumption that we have, that's in the name Doomer Optimism, is that we do see our current civilization crumbling. It's not long for this world. It's not sustainable. And there's going to be a lot of collateral damage, and a lot of things that happen are going to be just in reaction to, you know, both people seeking short-term solutions and people kind of, you know, trying to play the long game and, you know, work towards longer term solutions. And I guess, you know, a theory of change for us that, you know, that I think we've debated, Ashley, or talked about is, do we want to be, you know, do we want to connect with all of these other memetic tribes and do the memetic mediation thing, and have these, you know, get people at the table and what does everybody want, and or do we just want to do our own thing, and promote our values and make it stronger and more robust, and just be the proof of concept that we want to see in the world, to just make it, we're not going to argue with you anymore. We're just going to show that this is an alternative pathway. And so I'm wondering what you think about that in relationship to this synthetic leadership, about these two different
synthetic strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, I like this, like, what do I know? And I mean, I think it kind of comes back to where, you know, the goal. It's like, if you share a goal, like, definitely, like, keep doing your, you know, it's like, keep building out your strategy that you think is like the best or one of the best strategies for achieving the goal. Otherwise, you wouldn't be committing yourself to it, right? So, like, definitely keep like building that out. And to the extent that you encounter people with the same goal with totally different strategies, well, there's probably an interesting conversation to be had.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, if we might end up finding that, like, we don't actually share a goal, and then, like, one of us hasn't been totally, you know, or we might find that we do, and like, you're operating in a totally different circumstance than I am. And or like, you're the emergency measure that we never want to use, and we would only use it in order to get ourselves out of that situation so we can use the strategy, our strategy.
Yeah,
you know,
I think you actually mentioned kind of the middle ground that we find sometimes is, we usually talk with people who we feel our values are aligned, but we're open to talking with people who have different strategies to get there. So, for example, you know, when we talk to people in like the regenerative finance world, you know, we're both kind of skeptical of this kind of high tech coordination of regenerative activities. But, you know, we recognize that we have similar values, you know, we have similar kind of long-term visions for the future. And so, you know, then it seems, okay, well, you know, let's talk to these people, because, you know, we might have our own blind spots, and help them point out theirs, and that'll be good for everyone. But yeah,
Like,
if, you know, we don't normally have, you know, kind of, for example, techno utopian hyper capitalists
yeah,
on podcasts, because we're just like, or accelerationists or something, who are just, you know, longing for the singularity and they want to get off the planet. Like, we don't share the same values. We don't share the same.
totally.
We are not, you know, at least not now. We have nothing
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah, and that's kind of what it's like. If their goal is extending I mean, I'm just going to quote Elon Musk here, bear with me, extending the light of human consciousness, and they don't care whose consciousness and how many people make it, then that's a different goal.
Yeah.
You know, like justice does not factor into that. And I'm not even making a judgment value here. I'm just saying, like, that's a different goal.
Yeah. I think going back to this food system example, I want to just say I think something out loud that I think is implicit, and I don't know, maybe we haven't said out loud before, but I think the reason a lot of us talk about the homestead level is it's like the minimum viable scale that can help us get to this values goal of you know, regenerating ecosystems. And one thing I found in my dissertation research, where I talked to like basically, you know, small scale producers in Chicago, is you can't not notice the ecology when you're working on that scale.
Totally.
You have to, you are so in it and of it, and it's so close to you. Whereas something like large scale monoculture, it's far away, it takes less humans in the landscape. So there is something like fundamental that in this case is a heuristic that with the smaller scale comes a more embedded ecology.
Totally. And that is a perfect example about how the tool that you use affects the circumstance, right? Because then we're all noticing the ecology. And what does that do to like, what does that do to everything? That changes everything.
Right. And I think that's really important. I mean, like in Chris Mage's book, A Small Farm Future, like a lot of people talk about, you know, well, how does that scale or whatever. But like the most regenerative systems in human history were humans interacting with the landscape regularly, all the time in some way or another. Now, I don't know what that means in terms of like what we do now when so many people are in cities. I mean, Empty America Adam was on Doomer Optimism, and it just released, and like the amount of urbanized population is so huge. Like almost nobody's on the landscape, nobody has those skills. So then you have to start thinking about this time factor and building skills and stuff like that. But fundamentally, if the goal is more ecological embeddedness, you have to have more people embedded in the ecology.
Yeah, and that's also a great response to the like, oh, but we're never going to produce enough food that way. It's not even only about that. That's not even only maybe the most important thing that strategy is doing. You know? Yeah. So
what I mean, so this is kind of maybe an aside, but maybe it directly pertains. You know, in kind of the regenerative ag world, I see two major strategies at play, and I think that they can meet somewhere in the middle. And that is, one strategy is much more of like the local foods, like making local food systems more robust. Small scale farms, homesteads, self-provisioning, you know, building up infrastructure and communities for, you know, local production and local consumption. And then the other one, and this is characteristic, for example, there's a podcast called the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, and his whole theory of change is, I'm trying to convince large scale, mostly monocropping, you know, industrial inputs, chemicals, fertilizers, all the whole thing, to slowly adopt new methods and see for themselves that it's actually improving their lives. It's taking they're not getting into as much debt because they're spending less on inputs. You know, their land is improving, you know, et cetera. And so that's, you know, that's a much more kind of large scale, like let's reform, you know, the current actors versus let's create a whole new set of actors at you know, a smaller scale moving out. And for me, it's like, well, you know, I'm glad that both are happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they'll meet in the middle, because I think that there is, you know, there is argument for scale in certain types of production, right? Whether
Mm-hmm.
it's holistic management over large tracts of land, whether it's in the shorter term staple grain production, just to get calories in people, you know, while you slowly, you know, implement more regenerative practices, you know, whatever it is, you know, with cover crops or, you know, whatever it is. And anyway, so, but that's
Yeah,
within the, so that those are two theories of change within kind
totally.
of the broad scale tent regenerative paradigm. Um,
And maybe they don't, maybe they're still kind of filling out their possibility space. Like maybe we don't yet know like where the boundary, where that end, you know, it's like let them both kind of fill it all out and then we'll kind of see
yeah,
like you know where the and it's like maybe and maybe those are like the ideal strategy at different scales.
yeah,
So that's all that's going on is we're just like filling out the possibility space just at different size scales.
right.
So, um, but just to like to make it real with a totally different example, more from maybe the world that I come from. So free speech. So right now, right, we're all kind of well, maybe not all. My world is like Center for Humane Technology, Elon, Twitter, free speech is like what's up, and and you could say it's like there's like many different people, let's say, with the goal of like enabling freedom of expression who have very different strategies or ideas about how to achieve that goal,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what that would look like on a platform like Twitter. And so what I would say or how I would approach the situation from a synthetic strategy kind of a sensibility is like, okay, all of us who are interested in freedom of expression, or all of us who are like, let's just take the trope. You know, more speech is a remedy for bad speech. Let's just take that trope, or let's just take the principle of freedom of expression, First Amendment, as like like something that is integral to our democracy, right? But like what? So okay, well then, what would it even look like to have a thriving marketplace of ideas where more speech actually is a remedy for bad speech? Like, how would we even know that that is the case? Let's identify some indicators that that is actually the case. Well, wormholes between echo chambers. I don't even know the things that we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation. Like we can actually come up with some indicators, and then your like different strategies are either moving those indicators in the right direction or not. Like there is an answer to the question, is the strategy working? So
Yeah.
it's like cool, you're invited to the table, but like your strategy is either working or it's not. You know, and we can see that and we can track that. And like I can say I'm just as interested in free speech as you are. The question is like, is it working?
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's too abstract, but
Well, it seems
yeah.
this might be getting too specific, but it seems like the fundamental issue is the business model of
Oh, well, yeah.
advertising based, you know, marketing, A/B testing, algorithmically fueled propagation of the most polarizing speech. And you know, like it's interesting, you know, in the last few years, I've seen the debate shifting between, you know, we're having this propagation of just fake news, and both sides are accusing the other side of generating the fake news. To and then I've seen a response, you know, by these companies, and now the main topic is they're suppressing free speech. And it
Yeah.
seems like this unsolvable problem until you get a step deeper and say, well, what is driving
Incentive.
all of
Yeah.
the dynamics? And it's our economic framework for our social.
Per the micro burger investor not being interested in,
I was
right,
just going to
like
say that.
yeah. So but I would say, Jason, even in the best faith, even it's like everyone, you know, radically, you know, it's cooperatively owned and governed, you still need a content moderation policy.
Mhm.
You still need some kind of policy that's like what's allowed, what's not allowed, what do we kick you out for, blah blah blah. How do you come up with that? Okay, what that in that context, it's like, all right, what's the goal? What are the indicators? How do we know we have a thriving marketplace of ideas? And like the connection here is like, maybe we need to use a strategy we don't like. Maybe we need stricter content moderation policies. Right now, we're like at petulant 2-year-old stage, right? We're all just like fighting with each other and like straw manning each other and dunking on each other. So maybe we need a more commanding kind of a strategy to get to our to like kind of like learn our manners so that we don't need it as much anymore. But the free speech absolutists in the room are like, no, never. And it's like, what's the goal? Remember the goal? Like, what was the goal again? Oh yeah, robust marketplace of ideas. Like a circumstance in which in which more speech is a remedy for bad speech. Like, we're not there right now. The circumstance is not that.
I'll just put my cards on the table and say that I think this problem is unsolvable until you fundamentally address the
I don't disagree with you.
Ecological collapse that I
yeah.
is kind of, you know, and just collapse in general, biophysical collapse in general, that I see almost all of this kind of accelerating memetic insanity almost as an epiphenomenon of that. Not quite, because it has feedback loops back into our behavior that, you know, that do that, but that's me putting kind of my, you know.
Okay, but then let me ask you, like, what does that even mean practically speaking? It's like, everybody who's working on that, stop.
Well,
only work on it. You know,
it's that we're all disembodied. We're stuck in our minds and become stuck in meme space, and nobody knows really what's true anymore. And
yeah,
if you were to have a group that were say, these are the content moderation rules, and it's gone through the whole integral synthetic strategy approach, and these are the ideal rules, there's still going to be a lot of people who are going to be like, why do you get to set those rules, right? And what is your actual agenda? Is it for the World Economic Forum? Is it for, you know?
I mean, yeah. Well, that's why it's
you know,
the rubber meets the road with the goal.
Yeah.
Right. The rubber meets the road with the articulation of the goal, or of the indicators that let us know whether we're achieving the goal. If we can't agree on that, yeah, that's going to be problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's me. From, you know, from our perspective, I think that's one reason why a lot of these issues were like, yeah, these are all big issues, but, you know, our focus so much on food systems, on energy, on, you know, connection with the land, to us seems to be just so fundamental that we've lost that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree, Ashley.
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, I think like the Doomer Optimist ethos is that, like, there is, it's almost, I mean, it's almost like proto-Christian, like there is a reckoning coming, like whether or not we really are ready for it. And the reckoning will force us to be like, I mean, maybe some of us will be able to escape it through some power dynamics, but like will force us to be more embodied, and that will have good consequences for all of us in meeting these values goals that we set forth. You know, I think like back to the comments from before, the difference between like the world that we were saying ought to be versus the world as it is, like, is this just idealistic versus like being practical about the world as it currently is, and like incentive structures for making money and everything around shareholder capitalism and all that. Yeah, I don't know. I just think like we're really interested in like that play there. Like, you know, what is the world as it is? How is it playing out? How is it reaching ecological, social, whatever limits? And then what are people doing about it? And then, yeah, like what can we encourage and for what reason? You know, like I think when it comes to homesteading, whichever issue you're worried about in the modern context, like having a small garden helps. I mean, totally. I don't know, maybe not. Now I sound like Bitcoin fixes this person, but like, but there is something to like a more embodied existence in some way or another.
Totally.
You know.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's it's like so open-minded, even willing to be closed-minded. It's like, no, I'm actually closed-minded about the fact that no matter what your problem is, you should probably grow food. I mean, that's like Jason, your tweet that keeps on coming. It's like when this under this circumstance, grow food. Under this other
Yeah.
circumstance, also grow food. So there are some things that we can just say are like more universal, and that's okay. And like I like food is in there. I would say, and I would say coming from like where I come from, reckonings, like my focus on consciousness or sense making, or it's like being in touch with your way of understanding, knowing, like being able to like abstract yourself from it enough to like examine it. I think that is like a sure, I'm gonna call that universal,
Hmm.
worth universally worthwhile. So sure, there are like some things that we can just say, actually, under all circumstances, that's allowed,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
I mean, like, reflecting on this conversation as we're wrapping up, like, I think to me, it as a tool is just super aligned with like lots of the conversations we've been having. Like some insights involve like using the right tool for the right thing, not being super ideological about your tools, or being open to the fact that like maybe your tool doesn't work in all circumstances, not attaching your identity to it. And I think also, yeah, I think this tension that kept coming up about the difference between, I always say like is and ought, like the world as we want it to be versus the world as it is. And like thinking about these strategies in those two worlds, like what are our values driving toward, but let's, work on achieving goals with the world as it is in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I that the is and ought, I think that's kind of what identifying circumstances kind of, it's like there's the current one, and then there's other ones, and some of them are ones that we want, and like, take a look at that. And the ones that we want, there are different tools that we're using that are more
Right.
fun, like interesting.
Yeah. I mean, just yesterday, The Economist released an article about what Wendell Berry and how
Uh-huh.
he's like a figure we might
Wow.
pay
In The
attention to.
Economist.
And it's like one of those things where um, us in our the world ought to be this way have been saying like pay attention to Wendell Berry. He's
Mhm.
really great. But then there's a moment where like the is comes in, and then there's like a point at which you should use your agency, like look,
Yeah.
let's keep this going. We've been saying this ought to be for a while, and now it's starting to become what is.
Yeah, I love Wendell Berry in The Economist. That's pretty
I
cool.
know. I was like, what is happening? Okay,
Yeah.
so I guess wrapping up, like final thoughts, like I guess practically, where do you see this heuristic or tools used? Like next steps, what are you thinking about with this tool? Obviously, it's you know like useful as a set of heuristics model. Yeah, what are your thoughts about it?
I mean, again, it's like you heard it debuted here, folks. I don't, it's funny, it's like I actually wonder, maybe I should ask Daniel Goleman, like, has any organization put this into practice where they actually like change the leader based on the situation they're in? I mean, there's an orchestra called Orpheus Orchestra. I mean, adaptive leadership is a thing. Adaptive strategy is a thing. Adrienne Marie Brown. But I was going to mention there's an orchestra called Orpheus Orchestra that they change the conductor based on the piece that they're playing. But then there's the added piece of like, it's not just descriptive, it's also normative. It's not just like, which way do we want to use? It's like, it's also like, what way feels the best for all of us, so that we can move more in that direction. But as far as like next steps, I mean, I guess I would just invite listeners to once you see the matrix in this way, haha, like you'll know you might start kind of like seeing it, like when you see people kind of fighting about Bitcoin, whatever it is, it's like, well, actually, what if we thought about it as under what circumstances, if any, is which way the way slash like the way that we prefer, and like even just that sensibility, like because I get maybe, yeah, the last thing I'll say is with that sensibility in mind, it actually maybe is less problematic that we identify with the tool that we're giving birth to. Like if there's a new tool that's like really new that we've never had, and we're so excited about it that we identify with it, maybe that's not actually really a problem if like this is a sensibility that we have. And then it's just like, well, I'm just identifying with it because I'm really excited about it and it's new. But I kind of know that eventually it'll just join the matrix. It'll just join the tool belt, you know? So like the way that we identify or the way that we kind of, you know, argue about, like, it'll just maybe like take the edge off a little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is the kind of take home message here of, you know, be true to your values, but be flexible in terms of your strategy and your frameworks and ways of thinking about approaches?
That sounds really good. Yeah, like be and like stay connected to your goal and to other people who share that goal. At least like have a stated interest in that goal, because there might be a worthwhile, you know, like constellation of tents to make right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that. Yeah, that's a perfect way to end, because that's yeah, I think something basically that we're trying to build here. So yeah, so Stephanie, that was awesome. I loved this conversation. It was like so fun and playful. It was like playing. So that was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Yeah, last words. Just follow you on Twitter. Where else can people connect with you?
After all that, and follow me on Twitter. I am pretty active on Twitter. Go ahead.
How do you want to engage with Doomer Optimism in the future? Do you want to, for one, do you want to be baptized? That's the first.
Yes, I think.
We'll welcome you into the fold.
That's the goal. What are the differences?
Yeah, how do you see the Center for Humane Technology interfacing, and not just that, everything that you do, interfacing with everything you've observed of what we're trying to do with Doomer Optimism?
I mean, I see it beyond Center for Humane Technology. I see my interface very much as a content creator, because I have a like, not that I'm like such a high level of influence, but a high level of, well, at a high enough level of influence, you're no longer just talking about the world, you are shaping the world, right? So that, and like, and not that I'm like such an influence, but like, it's also the case that I think I mentioned this in the conversation with Michael Garfield, and God said, right? Speech is an act of creation. So I feel very committed to taking responsibility for my acts of speech or for my acts of content creation, and to be Doomer optimistic about it, because it's like, I'm not just like, oh, look at this thing that's happening. It's like me pointing out this thing that's happening, or the way that I think it's happening is going to affect you, is going to affect us as we go in and interact with the thing that I just said is happening. So I feel very committed, you know, Doomer optimistic code of conduct for content creation. I don't know, but that is the way that I would say I interface, is by having a commitment to being Doomer optimistic about the content I put out into the world. Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
This is super fun.
Yeah, very fun. We've got a little bit of so I'll just say thank you for coming on. But we've got a little bit of a backlog, I think, by a few weeks. But yeah, this will go up on the Patreon, and we'll let you know when it's live for the general public.
Thank you for being willing. Again, I really have not talked about this with anyone, and I was like, what about? And it felt like there was kind of like a sensibility, kindredness.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I've got to run, guys. Nice to chat again, Stephanie, and we'll see you on Twitter.
Okay.
All right. Bye, Jason.
Bye, Ashley.